we go again. We, our church, called for a meeting between myself and the Pope before he came to visit Ireland, and the meeting went ahead, and I met with other survivors with the Pope, and that was a learning exercise where I found out a little bit about his thinking on how the abuse crisis should be looked at and how it should be handled. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. I also want to look at how things are now in Ireland, and also what we should expect from this forthcoming summit in the Vatican in February, where the principals of all the conferences of bishops around the world will be coming together to discuss the protection of minors with the Pope. And also, I'd like to just touch on what we as laity can be doing to move forward the church and ensure they're making all the changes to keep children safe within it. Sadly, here in Ireland, I see a sort of complacency creeping in. There seems to be a feeling gaining ground that the crisis is behind us. It's all taken care of now, Why do we need to keep talking about it? Everything is fine, we've good safeguarding. There's a lot of abuse in society anyway, so why concentrate on the church? Well, it's true that there is better safeguarding now than there was in the past. Church and state have both put in better safeguarding, and the church includes auditing of their handling, which is very good. It's positive, but of course there's always room for improvement. However, this only came about because of the outrage among people and the pressure which came about on the church due to the horrific revelations of abuse and the deliberate cover-up by the institution. The problem is that this is the pattern in the church. It's the same mechanism which we've seen in other countries where survivors have come forward and where the scandals have been exposed. America, Australia, Chile. We see the church reacting with improved processes because they've had to be seen to be doing something. The problem is that while in these countries there may be improvements, there's still a long way to go, and we need to realise this. We also, and more importantly, need to realise that any improvement, despite what has happened in these specific places, it is not universal. It is only happening in the countries where there has been public outrage. Other countries are just being left idle. The church has not acted proactively, it has always acted reactively. It has reacted to media, it has reacted to bad publicity, it has reacted to anger from the laity. But where that's not happening, it's just sailing along, doing nothing. You would imagine that the experience they have gained in the countries where the abuse crisis has come to the fore and where they've had to deal with it and put in new measures, you'd imagine they'd use that experience in all the other countries where that has yet to happen, but they just don't do that. That would be logical, but sadly the church doesn't use logic at times. So the experience from those countries where the abuse crisis has been faced is not being used to bring universal policies into place for the countries where it has yet to occur. I've seen recently that an example of how this, they keep reinventing the wheel, if you like. In each country where survivors come forward for the first time and begin to speak out, the church reaction is a mirror image of what we were hearing here 30 years ago. I spoke recently to somebody from Poland where it's just beginning to break. Survivors are beginning to come out, they're beginning to be given a voice by the media. And the bishops, they are saying, oh, these people are all angry enemies of the church. It's a media conspiracy. The media have an agenda against the church. None of this is true. There is no abuse. We have not got abuse. This is all something that is being blown up out of all proportion. And hearing that, there is such a strong echo of what we heard the bishops here saying 30 years ago. But there's absolutely no excuse for bishops in a country in 2019 reacting in that way to revelations of abuse and trying to persuade the laity in that country in the same way the bishops tried to persuade the laity here that the survivors were just enemies of the church. In 2019, it's a disgraceful attitude. You can be sure there's abuse of minors in every country where the church has a presence, as it's in every society. Yet the sort of sleeping mandarins in leadership in the church seem to feel if they turn a blind eye, it will stay hidden and they'll not have to deal with it. We've seen that in other cases, like the McCarrick case in America. See no evil, hear no evil, and it'll go away. But the problem is that while they look away, children are being hurt. In my view, children everywhere must be safeguarded from abuse, and there has to be the strongest possible penalties for the perpetrators and for anyone in leadership who would protect them. But unfortunately, this is not happening. When we look at it from our country or in America or something, we can feel that things are moving, things are happening. But we're looking at it from a very insular perspective, and we need to look at it on a more universal perspective. Getting back to the Pope's visit to Ireland and my conversation with him, on his way home to Rome, after his Irish visit, he commented during his press conference that I was fixed on an accountability tribunal. That was something that I really was very interested in and still am. And he said he had tried to explain to me that he was using another, more appropriate means, instead of an accountability tribunal, to hold guilty bishops to account. He said in this press conference he did not understand. He said, I did not understand. And next time I was in Rome, as he knew I came to Rome quite regularly, next time I was in Rome, he would explain it to me. Now, I've been in Rome since, but it hasn't happened. In fact, the week I was there, he was busy talking to Bono. Far more important. But the history behind his comments might be interesting. At risk of reinforcing his criticism that I am fixated on this accountability tribunal, I'll say a little more about it for those of you who may not be aware of what it's all about. In 2015, the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors, which was set up to advise the Pope on how he could change things in the Church to make children safer. I was a member of the Pontifical Commission for 3 years, and I was there during this time. We recommended to the Pope that he set up a tribunal in the Vatican to judge bishops who were accused of negligence, of covering up, of protecting abusers, all around child sexual abuse, or the abuse of minors is the same thing. We put this proposal to him, backed up by documentation, changes in Canon Law, etc. And on the 10th of June that year, the Council of Cardinals, the C9, that's his sort of kitchen cabinet, his advisors, they announced that he had accepted this and approved this recommendation, and that he had promised to provide all the necessary support needed for it. Finance, personnel, he would give them all in order to set up this accountability tribunal, this central tribunal to hold bishops accountable. A thing which survivors and so many people in the laity have been calling for so long, to ensure that no bishop, no church leader will protect someone who is abusing and so facilitate more abuse. We were all very pleased about this because we thought at last things are beginning to happen. But 3 months later, the Commission learned that the tribunal had been blocked. It was not going to happen. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the dicastery which was to have developed it, had refused. And we discovered later on in March 2017, which was just after I resigned from the Commission, partly due to this development, the prefect of the congregation, Cardinal Muller, said they decided that was not necessary. And this is despite the fact that the Pope had approved it. He had promised to give it all the support necessary, yet one of his civil service departments just said they weren't going to do it. So at my meeting with the Pope last August, I had one question obviously for him, and that was why he had not followed through, why he had allowed them to block it. If he approved it and thought it was a good idea, why had he let it run into the sand? I got some answers, but not always the ones I would have hoped for, and not as much as I would have hoped for, but he did answer very clearly, and I believe his answers were very straightforward. There was no manipulation or defensiveness. He was quite clear in his answers, and I was quite sure he was giving truthful answers exactly as he saw it. So his answer to me was that a tribunal was not the way it should be done. Now, this is despite the fact that he had approved it a year earlier. He told me that bishops could not be held to the same standard across the world. They had to be held to different standards in different countries. He said allowances had to be made for their cultural differences and their different understandings of abuse. This meant, he said, they needed to be judged in their own areas and not centrally in the Vatican. I challenged him on this face to face by saying that the Church should have a standard of safeguarding to which every leader must be held. Children should be as well protected, as Colm has said there, in the Church in Africa or India as in America or in Ireland. Canon Law is universal. Catholic doctrine is universal. Safeguarding should also be universal. While the Pope said he was holding bishops accountable under the system in place, he also said that he had removed guilty bishops, and that they were being held accountable. Now, I only had 10 minutes to have this conversation, so I couldn't pursue it in great detail. I couldn't pursue it any further. But I now know from his later comment that he was of the opinion I was arguing with him because I didn't understand what he was saying about cultural differences and having to have different standards for different bishops. I did understand very clearly what he was saying. I just didn't agree with his conclusions. But what I didn't understand and didn't get an explanation was what brought him to change his mind after approving the Central Tribunal in the first place. It appears to me that the Pope, a very sincere man, a very, very good man, he can change his mind on things depending on the advisors he's listening to at any particular time. And we saw that with what happened in Chile, where he believed advisors and got it very, very wrong. And I do believe that can happen. And advisors get to him and they convince him of certain things, and he can change dramatically from one point of view to another. So there's a little bit of shifting ground there that you don't know exactly where you stand. On his words in respect to local culture, it's my view that if there are things that are acceptable in local culture that would not be acceptable in other areas of the world, then it's up to the Church to raise the standard and education, not to lower their standards. Not to lower the standard because the standard of protection in the culture is lower, but to bring that cultural standard up to the same level everywhere. It's not a nice thing to mention, so I won't mention it in detail, but you're aware, if you're aware of it, there's such a thing as FGM, which is something that is mutilation of young girls, and that is acceptable culturally in some areas of Africa. I mean, the Church is trying to tell us because it's culturally acceptable, it's right. That's just an example. So I think the Church has to set its standard not drop below that, and apply it to every bishop, every conference of bishops, every religious order. They all must reach the same standard of safeguarding for a child. An argument I didn't get the opportunity to put to him, but which I would have done if I could, was that it's obviously we must respect people's cultures. I'm not saying you ride roughshod over cultures, but we must also respect the rights of the child. If the church is having difficulty deciding which should take precedence, the culture or the safety of the child, they could take their guidance from the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 3. And Article 3 states, in all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions, courts of law, administrative authorities, legal bodies, etc., the best interests of the child shall be a primary consideration. So if you got to choose between culture and the safety of the child has to be the primary consideration, and therefore the decision always must be in favour of the child. Now, in fact, the Holy See has signed up to that, to the rights of the child. But it's really a technicality, because they claim it only applies to the Holy See and to the Vatican City. It does not apply across the church. But I think it's time that they recognised its provision universally and not see as it only holding any relevance in the tiny patch that is Vatican City. Whereas we know, in fact, they don't even have safeguarding policy. They were challenged on this recently, why they didn't have a safeguarding policy. They have a young seminary, they have altar boys, they have thousands of children passing through every day. They have no safeguarding policy. And the answer from the powers that be in the Vatican was, we're working on it. In 2019, they're still working on it. It's so frustrating. It really is just so frustrating. The Catholic Church is global, as we know. It's the universal church. It can be a force for good. It can raise the level of safety of all children by the example that they give. But they need to make a firm decision to do that. In 2012, the first Vatican-sponsored gathering of Episcopal representatives from around the world to discuss child sexual abuse took place in Rome. This one coming up in February. It's nothing new really, although people think it is. It's the second one. This symposium that took place on the sexual abuse of children was called Towards Healing and Renewal. It took the form of presentations from experts on the issue. It had breakout educational workshops. There were discussions in language groups. There was a lot of very good interaction and learning over 3 or 4 days. It was intended to be, I was present because I was speaking at it. It was intended to be the beginning of a global response to the abuse issue. Some of the organisers were the same as those now organising this February meeting coming up. But unfortunately, although there were a lot of promises that follow on from this meeting, it was to be a beginning. Nothing came from it, really, no results whatsoever. They produced a book with all the presentations and the workshops, a huge amount of information and resources, which would have been of use to any bishop trying to deal with a case of abuse. It was printed in different languages, and then it was shelved somewhere in the Vatican and never really seen again. So will the same be the fate of this new initiative? Will there be a lot of talk and fanfare and then nothing happens? That's what I think we have to avoid. So to avoid that, what do we really need to see on the agenda? I can only say what I believe we need to see. Everyone has their own ideas, everyone has their own priorities, so I can only speak from what I see and believe should be there. It's important that as a very first step, participants should agree on the definitions of certain terms commonly used around the issue of abuse. At the moment, while the terms used are familiar, they can be very different meaning to different people. I've taken part in the training of new bishops every September for the last couple of years in Rome. There's a couple of hundred bishops come to Rome every year for 2 weeks. They're newly in their posts and they come to Rome for training. They get an hour in that 2 weeks on abuse. I've spoken for 10 or 15 minutes at those presentations. But during those training sessions, I've had the opportunity to meet with some of these new bishops from many parts of the world and hear their questions and engage with them. And it's become very obvious that although a lot of them use the same phrases, the meanings are entirely different to them. Their understanding of them is entirely different. So it's important before anything else that this ends and that all these bishops around the world and church leaders are on the same page, that when they're talking about something, they're all talking about the same thing, not using the same words, but actually meaning something different, because that just leads to chaos. At this meeting in February, I think it's the 21st, the 24th of February, I think first the participants, who will be the principals of every Episcopal conference from around the world. So every country will be represented, every bishops' conference will be represented, so it is truly global. And it is a wonderful opportunity to get things done and set in place where things will be consistent and universal. But the first thing I think they need to do, you have to get your foundations and your basic and your nuts and bolts right before you start trying to build on them. So the first thing I think they need to do is agree a clear definition of what constitutes sexual abuse of a minor, and then commit to abiding by it in all cases. The Vatican has not clearly set out what actually constitutes sexual abuse of a minor in the view of the official church. All we have is a canon law. And this canon law is extremely vague. It speaks of derelicts against the sixth commandment of the Decalogue. Now, delect, I do apologise. Delects, no plural, just delect.
No. Anyway.
Delect, I apologise profusely. My clerical training is not up to scratch. Derelict against the sixth commandment of the Decalogue. Now, while that has meaning, obviously, to those within the church, and it would to me too, I have a semblance of an understanding, but it is not a clear definition of what constitutes abuse. If somebody comes in and reports that they have been abused and they say, this was done to me, you can't look at that and see, is that abuse or not abuse? And if you compare it to the definition here in the local Irish church, in their safeguarding guidance, you'll see what I mean. And this is the sort of thing I'm thinking needs to be put in place by the church to make things very clear. Some of this is a little graphic, but I'm going to read it anyway, so I hope I don't upset anybody, but I'm warning you in advance. This is what is in the Irish Church's safeguarding guidelines, the National Board. Sexual abuse occurs when others use and exploit children sexually for their own gratification or gain, or the gratification of others. Sexual abuse may involve physical contact, including assault by penetration, for example, rape or oral sex, or non-penetrative acts, such as masturbation, kissing, rubbing, and touching outside the clothing. It may include non-contact activities, such as involving children in the production of sexual abuse images, forcing children to behave in sexually inappropriate ways, or grooming a child in preparation for abuse, including via e-technology. Sexual abuse is not solely perpetrated by adult males. Women can commit acts of sexual abuse, as can other children. Now, I think reading that, you have a very clear picture of what constitutes abuse, unlike the derelict against the sixth commandment, the Decalogue. And so when people within the church are talking about child abuse, they need to know what they are talking about. And many of them haven't got a clue. They just have their own idea of what they're talking about. In fact, I'm sure many of them do not look on non-contact abuse as abuse at all. Probably don't think such a thing exists. It was part of my abuse, and I can tell you it destroyed my life for years. But I'm sure there are many bishops within the church would think unless a child is raped, it's not abuse. So we do need a clear, set-down description of what constitutes abuse before we start. And at the moment, the vagueness of the Canon Law in regard to abuse, it often leads to Canon Law trials not being able to bring the guilty verdict in cases where most people would see clearly abuse has occurred. But because they have to stick very closely to the set-down law, the inflexibility of that law makes it very, very difficult sometimes to bring in findings of guilt when they want to, but it just is not possible. It also affects things like credible accusations, etc. And if there's no consistent agreement across the church as to what is sexual abuse of a minor, how can we have any hope of consistent handling of that abuse? So that would be the first thing I'd like to see them do. The second would be to agree on a clear definition of the term zero tolerance and commit to its implementation in line with the Pope's promise. The Pope has promised there be zero tolerance in the church for anyone who would harm a child. However, the term again means different things to different people. Although I think to us, we understand the word zero. It seems to be fairly clear. There are those in the church, those who even think about zero tolerance, and not many of them do, but for those who do give it any attention, they discuss and talk about what level of abuse do we have to reach before we bring in zero tolerance, that sort of thing. So they need to agree exactly what is meant by zero tolerance, and when they have agreed it, each Episcopal conference attending, they should agree to implement it in their countries, in line with what the Pope has promised, and he promised it in his letter to the people of God not that long ago. So if they're going to follow through on the Pope's words, then we need every bishop's conference to say, right, we know what it means and we're going to do it. And then obviously to follow up from this, canon laws need to be updated to reflect this full definition of what constitutes sexual abuse of a minor, and also incorporates zero tolerance into its code. Now, I know writing canon law is not something that's done in 2 minutes, and they will take time to do it, but they have to decide on doing it and get started. Another thing they need to look at, I would feel at this meeting, is the canon law on the abuse of vulnerable adults. It needs to be separated from the abuse of minors. We've seen this recently, again in America, where we've had young seminarians, we've had young nuns in other countries who have been sexually assaulted or exploited by those in authority. And this is an abuse of power. And it's where there is a differential in power between the abuser and the victim. And in these cases, the victims can be over 18, but they're vulnerable due to their position of between the lower power they have as against those who are using their position to abuse them. But the thing is that this should not be confused with the abuse of minors. Two different things, two whole different contexts, and the two being confused together under one canon law is just not going to work. They need to separate the two out, because I do believe this abuse of power involving young adults is going to become more to the fore in the future. I think we're going to see more problems that have occurred in seminaries and convents, etc. So it needs to be clarity is what's needed. When you have confusion and obfuscation, you then get loopholes, mishandling, and you lose justice. The other thing, and the main thing I suppose that I'd like to see coming out of this meeting, is a universal safeguarding measures. In other words, instead of having the policy here in Ireland, the policy in America, the policy in Australia, we need a policy across the church. Now, obviously, there would have to be some deviations and differences for countries to take into account certain things in their own area. But the basic gold standard, best practice pieces of safeguarding should be down on paper and across the board and accepted by all these bishops from all these countries. Again, it goes back to the universal nature and the consistent nature of keeping children safe. It shouldn't be ad hoc, different in different places. If this was implemented, it would bring consistency to the way sexual abuse of minors is dealt with, no matter where in the world. At the moment, it often depends on the attitude of the local bishop, his willingness to do something, to take it seriously. And you might have one bishop who has been dealing with things very well and he retires, and another bishop comes in and has a totally different attitude and does things in a totally different way. That's not good enough. There has to be something that they must adhere to, and if they don't, there are consequences. And there also should, of course, as part of those measures, safeguarding measures, be an accountability policy for dealing justly with the reports of abuse and in the handling of survivors and care for survivors. I really believe that participants at this meeting should commit in writing to implementing these measures, zero tolerance in particular. It's not something they have to spend weeks discussing or parsing words and full stops and things. Zero tolerance. They decide what it means and they say, right, we're going to implement it because the Pope has said it's going to be present in the church and we're going to make sure it is. And any Episcopal Conference leader who refuses to comply and says he won't implement it, I believe he should be named and it should be made public that he's refused, and his explanation should be made public. Because the problem with the church is the lack of transparency. We've had so much secrecy, so much things going on behind closed doors. We really need accountability to us, the laity. When we talk about accountability all the time, but really there has to be accountability to us, the church. The Pope promised during his plain press conference, as we go back to it again, that he would explain to me the working of his accountability procedure for bishops, which he was implementing. Now the thing is, nobody knows what procedure is being used. They're just being told, well, there is a procedure and bishops are being held accountable, but we're supposed to guess what it is. And he said in that conference that when I went to Rome he'd explain it to me. Well, I'm not entitled to any explanation, but we are. Everybody is. Everybody in the church should know what is the procedure in place. So I would say that the Pope should make a clear statement at this meeting outlining what is the accountability process being used by the church to hold bishops accountable if they're accused of negligence, protection of abusers, or cover-up. Who's investigating, who are the judges, and what are the penalties? I can see no reason why this should be kept secret. If there is a process to ensure that church leadership are behaving properly and being held to account, we should know what that process is. People no longer take these things on trust because we've been misled too often. And I think that's why we now need these things to be out in the open. Because people no longer, and it's sad, people no longer trust and respect every word that every member of the church says, or every reassurance we're given, because we've been let down so often. Pope Francis, in that very short conversation, also told me that there had been guilty verdicts against certain bishops and he'd remove them from office. So if this is the case, and I believe it is, he wouldn't say it if it wasn't, he needs at this meeting to name those bishops who have a guilty finding against them. What was their offence? What were they found guilty of? What was their penalty? And he also needs to commit to making these guilty verdicts public in the future. Justice must be seen to be done. And allowing a guilty bishop to simply retire on the grounds of ill health or something and never have to take responsibility for his actions is no use. It doesn't send the right message to others who might think of behaving the same way. if what I've mentioned here as I feel needed in this meeting were actually to happen, and if all the presidents of the Episcopal Conferences agreed and committed themselves to implementation of true zero tolerance and universal safeguarding policy, be a huge step forward. But my fear is that what we will hear is that there has been a great deal of prayer, which is fine, reflection, and then we will be told there has been a lot of fruitful discussion, a term we, I think, are familiar with. We will be sure that things are moving forward and there will be promises for the future, but we need more than that. We have heard all that year after year after year. We need to see practical, concrete plans with time schedules, time frames. We are going to see that this happens by this date, whatever it may be. And all we can do is wait and see. It depends very much on the people who are running this, organising it, etc. It's gone, in my view, way beyond time for them just to sit down and have a talk about it. They have enough knowledge, basic knowledge now over the last 20 years to know exactly what they need to do. And if they don't, there's plenty of people telling them exactly, experts telling them exactly what they need to do. And ignoring that is immoral in my view. So, what should the laity here in Ireland be doing? Can we do anything? And just because things have moved forward here, it's not saying things could not be better, doesn't mean that we can rest on our laurels. We must look to what is happening outside this little island. We can't just sit and say, I'm all right, Jack, everything's good here. We've got to think of those in other countries who haven't got a voice. As I said earlier, the Church has shown it cannot be proactive. It moves only when it must in reaction to revelations, reports, anger among the laity. But why is this? Why is it so dysfunctional? While I've been speaking specifically about abuse in all other areas, the systems of the Church are equally dysfunctional. It's not only in the area of handling child abuse that the Church falls down, let's say. And some of this lies in the way the Vatican actually goes about its work. I sort of learned a lot about this in 3 years working on a pontifical commission. And some of it was quite mind-boggling to anyone who has ever been involved in just boards of management or anything. The way things are done and the way they are handled are extraordinary in a negative sense. Clericalism is embedded in the fabric of the Vatican. Its systems are inefficient. It's full of cumbersome bureaucracy. Jealousies between various departments lead to lack of cooperation. They won't talk to each other. When I was there in the commission, I was part of a papal commission appointed by the Pope. There were the Pope's civil service departments dealing with all the different issues. We wanted to see some documents, we wanted to talk to some people from these departments to learn about the work they'd been doing, and we were working on improving things. And they wouldn't talk to us and they wouldn't let us see the documents. Now, you'd think a papal commission and a papal department, no. They told us the information was confidential. We were working for the safety of children that had no active part in the whole thing. It was political. It was the way things work. We were sort of seen as outsiders, and you know, we were a pontifical commission, but we weren't really part of the curia, and therefore we sort of weren't entitled to be treated as inside part of the group, and they don't, as I say, even talk to themselves sometimes. So, but it seemed to me absolutely I couldn't get my head around the fact that we were working for the protection of children, to save children from harm, and they were getting tied up in their petty little political games and telling us that we couldn't see things like, we wanted to see whatever guidance documents some countries had sent in. We wanted to see them. We wanted to see how weak they were. Did they have things in them we could use? What was the sort of weakness that maybe went through a number of them, so we could use that to improve and advise what should be in them? And we were told these documents were confidential. And the insult that really, it went a long way towards my resignation, because I couldn't believe it, and they put it in writing. They actually said we couldn't see these documents as they were confidential, but there were a few of them on the internet, and if we liked, we could look them up there. I swear. Now, the attitudinal stuff there, and of course, most of us were lay and a lot of us were women, which didn't help. It didn't help at all. It made a big difference. And you wonder then why things don't move forward, why they get stuck. This sort of game playing and politics, and as I say, it's such a bubble, and it's institutional, and there's a lot of gossip, there's a lot of careerism, there's a lot of attaching to people above you, so you go up the slippery pole. The lack of sort of spirituality and things is mind-blowing. It's a shame, because there's so many good men there, but some of them have been there so long, they're just sucked into this way of doing things. So as I say, some of the reasons are the clericalism, the bureaucracy, the jealousies, and you have leaders. Now, normally if you have a department like a civil service department here, the person in charge, you expect to know, they know the business of the department they're heading up. Whereas in the Vatican, it tends to be that people are often chosen to head up departments and things because of their titles and their contacts, rather than any skill or expertise they might have in that particular area. It's all about the hierarchical. And it's considered that to hold a particular post, you have to have a particular title. When the title might have been earned in an entirely different way in an entirely different place. May not be specific at all to the job you've been given. The other thing that leads to all this inefficiency is that the common practice, and we've seen recently some cases of this reported, of promoting people within the church who've shown themselves to be incompetent. Promoting them. And this happens a lot when it's somebody in a already holding a higher office like a bishop. They're promoted in order to save them from the humiliation of being demoted. The bella figura, I hope my pronunciation is all right, is all important in that world. The saving of face. So he doesn't know how to do the job, or he's a complete idiot and can't manage. He's inept. So he gets promoted and put into another job, probably even more important job. So he can mess that one up as well. So how can that be the way to get efficiency and things done? A lot of people you will see outside the church and even inside the church saying, accusing the hierarchy and the administration in the church of sort of maliciously not doing things right. But an awful lot of it is down to this sort of dysfunctional, medieval type of stuff, which may have worked back hundreds of years ago when they were scratching on parchment. It doesn't work in the current times. But I think understanding all this and understanding how things work at this level is important if we want to change it. I don't believe change will happen if we wait for it to come from inside. The laity have to keep speaking out strongly for the changes and not be diverted. The obvious need for the involvement of the laity, including women, of course, at every level must happen if the church is to be brought into the 20th century alongside its people, because it's a long way from the 20th century, that's probably where they are. At every level must happen if the church is to be brought into the 21st century with its people. Persistence and patience is what is needed. There's no quick fixes, as we've seen. Sorry, there's no quick fixes. But no change will come unless we work for it. The only alternative to working for it and being patient and persistent and speaking out is to walk away. And in my view, that's not the answer. That's all I